Hi guys, so this is the third lesson and we're going to be looking at the internal components used in a server. Now it's worth noting here that the internal components used in a server will be much the same as those used in a PC because effectively a server is just a higher spec or more functional PC. So let's talk briefly about some of the components. And of course this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but just going through the things that perhaps you might be asked in your exam. Okay, so here we're going to look at the storage. Now, in terms of where we store all of that content that the server needs to hold, we would have a hard disk drive, probably, that would store terabytes of data. So we already mentioned in the previous lesson that we might be storing files, mail, web pages, games, etc. And so those content, of course, will be crucial to an organization or to the network that is storing that content. So it's very important then that the data that's being stored on the server is reliable and it would have some fault tolerance. So what we mean by fault tolerance is that if anything was to go wrong, we would have a way of being able to retrieve that data. So to do so, we use RAID storage. RAID is a topic that we'll cover in a bit more depth in a later lesson. Then in terms of the processing on that server, it would require multiple different computers connecting to the server, and as a result of that it needs to be able to handle all of those requests. And so on most servers you will have either a dual core, which means that it has twice the number of processing as a single core, or a quad core, which means it has the number of processing as a single core. And so effectively it has so for example, let's quantify that. So if we were to have a 2 gigahertz dual core, then effectively we would say 2 for the dual times 2, so that would give us 4 gigahertz of processing. And if it was a 2 gigahertz quad core, then that would be 2 times 4, which would be 8 gigahertz of processing, as in 8 gigahertz of being able to do the FDE cycle. It also have RAM, and in terms of RAM, what that is random access memory, and a typical server might have something like a 16 gigabytes of RAM, and this allows it to be able to store multiple applications that are running at the same time. And as we already know, a server would probably have multiple things running in the background, and without a sufficient amount of RAM, then it would affect its performance, because the RAM holds the processing of the data and instruction that the CPU needs to work on, and so it needs a lot of RAM to maintain performance. And the next thing is about the power supply to the server itself. As we mentioned before, we don't want our server going down, so if there was a power cut, we will probably have an uninterrupted power supply, which means that it's a battery that will maintain the operation of the device for a short period of time whilst the power is off, and then hopefully when the power turns back on, it will have power to carry on. It would also have some expansion slots to add additional devices to the server. For example, if we wanted to add a graphics card or another thing such as can't think of one here, for perhaps a wireless card, so that we can have our server connected wirelessly to, not that you'd want to do that to be honest, but if you wanted to add any other device to your server on the motherboard, you'll have additional slots for that. And then in terms of the network connection, we have an Ethernet connection on the server, and it will be fast Ethernet, which is 100 megabits per second transfer, or gigabit Ethernet, which is 1 gigabit per second, which is basically 1,000 megabytes per second. Okay, so that will be that. You can also have different form factors. Okay, so that is effectively the case of the server, and we can have it in as a blade format, or microserver, or a rack, or a tower. That probably wouldn't be anything in your exam, just additional information. And then you'd also have the operating system for the server as well. Okay, so the server's operating system will be specifically designed for a server. Now, we have a few minutes to just review a real server online. And so just go through here on eBuyer So if you look at this server, let's speak briefly about the components of it. So here we notice that it has a CPU of what we see here is a quad core CPU, talking about what we've been talking about before, and it's 2.1 gigahertz quad core. So if we think about that, then that means it's 8.4 gigahertz of instructions that it can process per second. And then we have the RAM. In this is a 8 gigabyte DDR RAM, and it's also SDR-AM, which again something else we will talk about when we talk about RAM in the future. And then this actually has also within it a 240 gigabytes of SSD and 1 terabyte of HDD. So often manufacturers would include a solid state drive for efficiency as well as speed. So for example, you might store your operating system on the SSD to allow it to boot up very quickly, and then you would store the data on the hard disk drive. Then that way, that's why we've got more storage here, because SSDs are more expensive to create and of course buy. So if you look a bit more about the technical specification of this, let's see what else it includes in terms of the components. So we talked there about the hard disk drive. Let's talk about the network. Yeah, so we see that it's got 2 gigabits, 2 ports of gigabit Ethernet. Yeah, so that's pretty much what we need to know about the internal components of a server.